Welcome back, everyone, to the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. I'm your host. Today's episode is the 10-Minute Report Lions. Before we jump in, please make sure you all are following me right here on Spotify, as well as check out my Instagram at Wedge52 Gridiron. If you guys are unfamiliar with the 10-Minute Report series, that is where I take 20 minutes of study plus my already established knowledge to create a 10-minute podcast. Make sure to check out the other 10-minute reports that I've been dropping every single day of July. And with that, let's jump into today's 10-minute report on the Detroit Lions. Starting off with their defensive backs help. They finally got some solid help, in my opinion. This has kind of been their main weakness for the past couple of seasons. During this offseason, they let Deshaun Elliott go safety. He signed elsewhere in free agency, as well as they traded cornerback Jeff Okudah to Atlanta for a third-round pick, if I'm not mistaken. But then they went out and they signed C.J. Gardner-Johnson, who last year was a stud in Philadelphia. He had 67 tackles, 6 interceptions, and 8 passes defense last year. His 6 interceptions led the league for interceptions in the 2022 season. He did that as an Eagle. He did have a slight scare yesterday or 2 days ago in training camp where he went down with what looked like a knee or leg injury and was carted off the field, but he was seen at practice again, and himself as well as Coach Dan Campbell both said that it looked worse than it was, and he should be good to go with no major hiccups here. So that's a good sign for the Lions and their big free agent signing, as well as they signed Cameron Sutton, who was in Pittsburgh for the past few years. Sutton had himself a decent season last year with 43 tackles and 3 interceptions, and a very good 15 passes defense. So those two guys are hopefully going to be the main corners, C.J. Gardner-Johnson is safety, but main 2 big new pieces on defense, as well as they signed cornerback Emmanuel Moseley, who played last year for the 49ers, and in 5 games, he tore his ACL, but in just 5 games, he had 22 tackles, 1 interception, and 5 passes defense. He's been seen at he was seen at training camp with a compression sleeve on the knee, and it looks like all things are pointing for him to be healthy at the beginning of the season. Moving on to the draft for the Detroit Lions that occurred in April. A couple of their picks were a tad questionable on timing of their selections, but nonetheless, the players they selected were good fits within their scheme, and they kind of, did not show any interest in positional value. Instead, they decided to take the best player available for the positions that they thought they needed most. So they drafted in the first round, running back from Alabama, Jahmyr Gibbs, who last year had 926 yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground, and 444 yards and 3 touchdowns via receiving with the Crimson Tide. So he's obviously a very good running back, potentially drafted too high, but the Lions decided they wanted a running back. He was probably the second best running back available besides Bijan, who went to the Falcons. And they knew that they lost Jamal Williams and they had traded DeAndre Swift. So they decided to take Gibbs off the board early. With their second round pick, I believe they drafted a linebacker from Iowa, Jack Campbell, who as an off-ball linebacker last year for the Hawkeyes had 59 tackles, 5.5 tackles for a loss, 2 interceptions, and a sack. So again, very good numbers for an off-ball linebacker especially. And I believe Jack Campbell was the only linebacker, maybe in the Power 5, but only linebacker without a touchdown allowed through to his man in zone coverage, dropbacks. So that should help out the Detroit linebackers, who are very solid now with the addition of Campbell. They have 3 solid linebackers, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But then another notable draft pick, again working on the secondary help, drafting Brian Branch, a safety out of Alabama, who last year had 58 tackles, 14 tackles for a loss, 2 interceptions, and 7 passes defense. So Brian Branch, obviously a downhill safety, plays the run very well with those 14 tackles for a loss. And that is something that, the Lions secondary is going to see. I predict that they should see improvement this year with the amount of, reinforcements that the Lions have made this offseason. And having a downhill safety is not only beneficial for run defense, but it is also a electrifier when your safety comes downhill, makes a play close to the line of scrimmage or even behind. And then another notable draft pick, a pick that I think is very good for the Detroit Lions. They drafted quarterback Hendon Hooker, quarterback out of Tennessee. He's coming off a ACL injury. He obviously will not be starting this year. He's not starting right now because of Jared Goff. Jared Goff had one of his better seasons of his career last year in Detroit. But Hendon Hooker is definitely a pick for the future that I personally really love for the Detroit Lions. I watched several Hendon Hooker and Tennessee games last season, and Hooker is a good, solid baller. Last year with Tennessee, he had 3,135 passing yards, 27 touchdowns, only 2 interceptions, and all of that on 69.6% completion percentage. So again, very efficient from Mr. Hooker. Only 2 interceptions, near 70% completion percentage, and that was through the air. And then he also had 430 yards and 5 touchdowns on the ground. He was leading a very good Tennessee Volunteers team who reached at their peak number 2 in the AP polls and were, potentially suited to make a run at the national title if Hendon Hooker did not go down with those couple games remaining. But the Tennessee Vols had a great year. I think Hendon Hooker was an excellent selection for the future for the Detroit Lions. Without, it wasn't a big high-risk pick. I think he got drafted in the 5th or 6th round. I like the move for the future. So moving on to some of the guys they picked up in free agency was David Montgomery. Like I said, they need running backs after Swift and Williams are gone. So they drafted Gibbs. They also picked up David Montgomery, who had a total of 1,100 yards and 6 touchdowns last year through the ground and receiving. They re-signed Marvin Jones, re-signed as in he played for the Lions before. Last year in Jacksonville, he had 529 yards and 3 interceptions. In his career, he has 542 receptions and 0 fumbles. They also re-signed Alex Anzalone, who had a great year last year for the Lions with 125 tackles, 1.5 sacks, 7 tackles for a loss, and an interception. So the addition of Jack Campbell and re-signing Alex Anzalone, as well as last year's rookie linebacker Malcolm Rodriguez, that is a very solid-looking trio for the Detroit Lions. Moving on to some players they already had. Detroit Lions, I predict, will have a top 5 offensive line this year. They were very solid last year, dealt with some injuries at times, but they should be led behind Penei Sewell, Taylor Decker, and Frank Ragnow. I would not be surprised if they look to add a little bit more depth especially at the tackle position, in case one of those guys goes down. And then they have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is starting to become a more noticed wide receiver. And last year had 1,161 yards and 6 touchdowns. They also have Jameson Williams, who will be facing a 6-game suspension. Last year, he had 1 reception that was a 41-yard touchdown. And then 2 years ago, his last year in college for Alabama, he had 1,500 plus receiving yards and 15 touchdowns. So the Lions will be looking for that kind of production after his suspension. Jared Goff, like I said, had one of his best years last year with 4,400 passing yards, 29 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and 65% completion percentage. My 10 minutes is up, but I cannot go through a 10-minute report for the Lions without mentioning Aiden Hutchinson, who last year had 52 tackles, 9.5 sacks, 9 tackles for a loss, and 3 interceptions as a rookie. All of that was good enough to make him second in Defensive Rookie of the Year voting to Mr. Sauce Gardner. So my 10 minutes has passed, which leaves me with just one thing, and that is my record prediction for the 2023 Detroit Lions, where I predict that they will go 12-5. That's all I have for the 10-minute report. Lions, thank you all for listening. Again, please check out my other episodes, as well as follow me on Spotify and Instagram at Wedge52Gridiron. Go Ravens.